The following stories were written by Franklin W. Dixon. They are currently in the public domain and are archived in the Gutenberg Project at gutenberg.org. The Hardy Boys, read by Rob Young. Hello, this is Rob. Just a reminder, if you enjoy my stories, please give them a thumbs up and consider subscribing. It really helps the channel get discovered. Thank you. The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. Previously in Chapter 13, Plan of Attack. The boys return to Bayport and mull over their options. They have their dad's cap and decide to turn it over to the police. They meet with Chief Collig and Detective Smuff, who are more interested in their checkers game than their dad's blood-stained cap. Frank threatens to go to the press, which gets Chief Collig's attention, and the chief and Smuff agree to go out to the Palooka house and question the occupants the next day. Their efforts are lazy and superficial, and they come away with no more details or insight than the boys were able to determine on their own. Frank and Joe realize the police are not going to put much effort into finding their dad, so plan to investigate further themselves. They believe the Palooka place may be a base for smuggling in Barmet Bay and connected to their dad's disappearance. They ask Tony if his dad would lend the chums his motorboat to investigate the shoreline from the water. They believe the Palooka house may have a hidden access by boat. Chapter 14, Private Property. The Hardy Boys explained their plan to Tony Preto, who promised to ask his father about the motorboat, provided they allowed him to go with them. "I wouldn't miss it for anything," he said. "You let me come along on this trip with you, and I'll see that we get the boat." "We wouldn't go without you, Tony," promised Frank. "I'll have the boat tomorrow afternoon. Be at the boathouse." Tony was as good as his word. When Frank and Joe appeared at the little boathouse, one of a long row of ramshackle buildings along the shore, next afternoon, they found Tony clad in a greasy suit of overalls, tinkering with the engine. He was of a mechanical turn of mind and could never see an engine of any kind without investigating its most intricate machinery. "She'll run as smoothly as a sewing machine," he declared, looking up. "We can start any time." "Your father let you have the boat all right?" "You bet. I told him it was to help find your father, and he was almost going to quit work and come along with us." The boys got into the motorboat, which was a rangy, powerful craft with graceful lines, and the engine was soon roaring. The boat, which was called the Napoli, in honor of Mr. Preto's birthplace in Italy, moved slowly into the waters of the bay, and then gathered speed as it headed toward the gloomy cliffs at the northern extremity of Barmet Bay. It was already late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast and the bay was rough. The salt spray dashed over the bows of the Napoli as it plunged on through the breakers. Bayport soon became a smoky haze on the hillside. The boys could see the white line of the shore road rising and falling on the coast to the north, and at last they came within sight of the Kane farm, nestled among the trees. The cliff upon which the Palooka place stood was stark and sheer against the background of the ocean and sky, and at the top they could see the grove of trees and the roof and chimneys of the haunted house. "Lonely-looking place," remarked Joe. "Pretty steep cliff," Tony observed. "I can't see how anyone could make his way up and down that slope to get to the house." "That's just why nobody has thought of the possibility of the place as a smuggling base," said Frank. "It doesn't look possible, but perhaps when we look around, we'll find that things are different." Tony steered the boat in toward the shore so that it would not be visible from the Palooka place. Then he slackened speed so that the roar of the engine would not be so noticeable, and the craft made its way along toward the bottom of the cliff. There were currents here that demanded skillful navigation, but Tony brought the Napoli through them easily, and at last the boat was surging along close to the face of the cliff. The boys scanned the formidable wall of rock eagerly. It was scarred and seamed, and at the base had been eaten away by the battering of the waves. Time passed, and there was no indication of a path, and the lads were disappointed. The cliff jutted up out of very deep water and rose to a great height. From the boat they were unable to see the Palooka place, for it was set in a short distance from the edge of the cliff. The face of the steep rock was uncompromising. There seemed to be no foothold for man or beast. It was just an unscalable, craggy wall. Suddenly, Tony bore down on the wheel. The Napoli swerved swiftly to one side, and at the same time the engine roared as the craft leapt ahead. Frank and Joe looked quickly around. "What's the matter?" they asked in alarm. But Tony was gazing fixedly ahead. He was tense and alert. Another shift of the wheel, and the Napoli swerved again. Then the Hardy boys saw the danger. There were rocks at the base of the cliff. One of them, black and sharp, like an ugly tooth, jutted out of the water almost immediately at the side of the boat. Only Tony's quick eye had saved them from striking against it. They had blundered into a veritable maze of reefs, which extended for several yards ahead. They held their breath. It seemed impossible that they could run the gauntlet of those rocks without tearing the bottom out of the craft. But Tony's steersmanship was marvelous. The motorboat threaded its way accurately among the jutting rocks. There was always the chance that a submerged reef might rip through the hull of the craft, but they had to take the chance on that. But luck was with them. The Napoli dodged the last ugly rock and shot forward into open water. Tony sank back with a sigh of relief. "Phew, that was close," he exclaimed. "I didn't see those rocks until we were right on top of them. If we ever struck one of them, we would have been a goners." The Hardy boys believed him. Angry waves dashed against the base of the cliff. They would not have lived more than a few minutes if they had been wrecked in this place. They would have been battered to pieces against the rocks. Suddenly, before them, they saw an opening in the side of the cliff. It was a long, narrow cove. The entrance was like the neck of a bottle, widening as it led into the cliff, and it was overshadowed by jutting rocks. It had been quite visible up to this time, and the boat had gone only a few yards further before it became invisible again. So well was the opening hidden by the rocks. "There's a find!" exclaimed Frank in excitement. "Let's turn back and see where this goes to." Tony swung the boat around, and the craft slowly made its way back toward the hidden cove. Soon the opening in the cliff came into view again. "It's just large enough for the boat to go through," said Tony. "Want me to try it?" Frank nodded. "Go ahead." The nose of the boat turned towards this strange bay, and then the Napoli began to enter the cove. "Maybe I won't be able to get out again," said Tony suddenly. He looked ahead, but the passage widened into a bay of considerable extent, quite sufficient in size to enable him to turn the craft around once he had entered. So he continued. But the cove proved uninteresting. The sides were steep, although dense bushes grew about the base of the slopes, but there was no path, no trail, no indication that any human being had ever been in the place. Being protected from the wind, the water was calm. The echoes of the motorboat's engine were flung back from every side in a roaring volume. Suddenly Frank gave a gasp of surprise. Standing among the thickets at the base of the steep slope was a man. He was very tall, and he wore a black felt hat, the wide brim of which obscured the upper part of his face. His countenance was tanned and weather-beaten. His lips were thin and cruel. He wore a short black jacket, and he stood with his hands plunged into the side pockets and his feet spread wide apart in the manner of a seaman. He was standing there quietly, gazing at them without a shadow of expression on his sinister face, as motionless as a statue. When he saw that he was observed, he called out, "Leave this place!" Tony throttled down the engine. The three boys stared at the man in the black hat as though he were an apparition. "Leave this place," he repeated in a curiously metallic voice. "We aren't doing any harm," replied Frank. "Not now," said the stranger. "But don't land here." "Why?" "You don't have to ask why. This is private property. You can't land here. You'd better leave at once." The boys hesitated. As though to emphasize his commands, the man in the black hat reached suddenly into his pocket and whipped out a wicked-looking revolver. Then he folded his arms, tapping the barrel of the revolver against one shoulder very deliberately. "Turn that boat around and get out of here," he snapped. "Don't come back. Don't ever come back. Don't ever try to land here. This is private property. If you ever do land here, you'll be shot." The boys were unarmed. They realized that nothing would be gained by argument. Tony slowly brought the boat around. "Goodbye," shouted Joe cheerfully. The stranger did not reply. He stood there, gazing fixedly after them, his arms still folded, still tapping the revolver against his shoulder as the motorboat made its way out of the strange bay, out into open water. "Looks as if he didn't want us around," remarked Tony, as soon as the Napoli was out of the cove. "I'll say he did," exclaimed Frank. "What a wicked-looking customer he was. I expected him to start popping at us with that gun of his before we got out." "I don't want to run into him again," declared Joe. "He sure gave us our orders, and he meant 'em, too." "I wonder who he is," said Tony. "Do you think, fellows? Do you think it could have been Snackley?" shouted Frank. Hello, I hope you are enjoying these adventures of Frank and Joe Hardy. Be sure to check back next week when we will have a new chapter.